Well, good Monday, everyone. Welcome to another Mondays with Manny. I'm your host, Manny Rodriguez, and this, of course, is a live cast, and I do have a live audience with me. But also, this is being recorded for the future, for future use for people that want to watch this video. We're discussing common problems organizations face and how to deal with them using science of behavior. Special thanks goes to the sponsor of Mondays with Manny, Business Science Magazine, 305 Publishing, the OBM Alliance, and of course, my teammates at Bueno Ventures. So thank you all for joining me who's here at the live cast. Of course, I'm going to open it up for Q&A at the end. That won't be recorded. That's only for you special folks that join me live. Everyone else enjoy the recording. We're only doing 20-30 minutes with Mondays with Manny. And actually, I'm part of a new panel. It's called Straight Talk through Behavior Leader with Dr. Natalie Parks. And sometimes we take some of the same topics that we discuss on Mondays with Manny and we go deeper. And that's for continuing education credits for HR professionals and for behavior analysts as well. I get no proceeds from that, so enjoy it if you want, and you can listen to me for an hour, but it's not just me, there's 4 others, so we have a good time. Anyways, so today's topic on Mondays with Manny is process. And what I really want to do is get into the world of process improvement because as many organizations face change going forward, I thought, and I've been involved with a couple of clients now who are talking about huge process improvement efforts, taking existing procedures and protocols, things that kind of work but kind of don't work, and simply put, they want to make a difference. They want to make changes to procedures and processes. But sometimes that's easier said than done. So just in the chat room for everybody here in the live, how many of you have ever been part of some type of like upgrade or update or change, modification of a process or procedure? Just go ahead and put yes or no. If you can, just list like the policy, the procedure that you got involved with. But just to give kind of a background while the live audience is answering that question, you know, when I say process and process improvement, I really mean any type of work activity that is interlocking different departments or a variety of different people to get the job done. So when we say process, there's usually multiple steps to follow. Sometimes there's handoffs within a process from one department to another department, or one person to another person who's doing different work, but it's all intended to have an output, right? An outcome, whether it's a deliverable or some type of objective measurable thing. So a simple example would be if you think about like a distribution center, right? And they have a process in which they receive the material, they inspect it, they package it, they ship it, right? All of those different pieces, but sometimes they're in different departments. And so there's handoffs along the way, but the ultimate output is the customer receives the product, right? So that's a simple illustration. Another one is if you think about in the world of human services, you have service delivery, right? Therapists that provide the services. You have a billing department that does the billing. You have an HR department that does the hiring, right? So you have all these different intricacies, right? That has to do with service delivery of human services. So processes become really important for work to get done. And the easier the process is, the better the output's going to be, right? So ultimately the customers who gets impacted by a process. Now in the world of OBM, there's some gurus in the field of processes, and they happen to be writers and authors and consultants. And the two are Gary Rumler and Alan Brosh. I hope I said that right. And they wrote a book many years ago. It's in its 3rd edition. This is the first one, called Improving Performance: How to Manage the White Space on the Organization Chart. And for those who study behavioral science, specifically in the work context, this becomes kind of like a go-to book for all things related to process improvement and really performance improvement in general. So, so I just got a couple of responses. So yes, one person said a hiring process, past company. Okay, good. Yeah, hiring process is very important. Lots of different intricacies in a hiring process, right? Recruitment, selection, onboarding, all that. And then another said, yes, building leadership team at my high school for improving department connections. Oh, that's cool. So imagine that, right? You got the teachers involved, you got the administrators involved, you got lots of different players, right? So all very important stuff. Great. So what I wanted to cover today was something that they covered in the book. I haven't really seen anybody really cover it this well or in this way before. And they refer to it as the seven sins of performance improvement, the seven sins of performance improvement. And I'm going to go through each of the sins and kind of give you a bit of a description of how to solve for that, right? Because you want to avoid these, right? So this is probably a compilation of many years of work by the two authors. And they found that more often than not, the reason why process improvement fails is one of these sins plays a role, and sometimes more than one. And so just out of curiosity, as I mentioned the sin, for those in the live group, just in the chat room, let me know if you have faced this before, if you've ever experienced any one of these seven before, and then I'll give you a couple of tips on how to avoid them in the future. All right, so without further ado, sin number one is process improvement is not tied to the strategic issues the businesses face. So you have a process improvement endeavor, and all of a sudden, you find that there's roadblocks to getting the work done because there's other priorities that take over. And that means all of this work effort, all of this time is being spent on process improvement, but it's really not tied to any type of strategic issue for the business. So that's sin number one. A lot of process improvement teams, they just stop what they're doing. They don't do anything anymore because they end up being circumvented into other priorities. So let me know if that's ever happened to you in the audience there. So how do you get over that? How do you make sure that doesn't happen? Well, golden rule number one of any process improvement is to make sure that there is a sponsor at the upper management level. So that way, the upper management, their biggest stewardship for the organization is strategic priorities. Most people who are at a director level, executive level, owner of a company, their main job is to make sure everybody's marching to the same beat, right? And that's called strategic priorities. The moment that they find, hear, smell, see anybody going away from those strategic priorities, they usually are the ones that navigate people towards their strategic priority. So the tip number one to make sure you avoid this sin of not being tied to a strategic issue is make sure your process improvement efforts are sponsored by somebody at that upper management level. Okay, so if you have any questions with that, feel free to jot them down in the chat room for those in the live audience. But let's go on to sin number two. The process improvement effort does not involve the right people, especially top management, in the right way. So have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to improve a process or a procedure? You get a bunch of people in the room and some are more helpful than others. Some may even derail the conversation a little bit. Maybe they have some personal pet peeves in the process and they want those fixed, but they're not really of value. Anybody? Maybe I'm alone. It's happened to me more than once. And so what that tells you is even with all greatest intentions, people need to be the right people in those rooms, right? So how do you determine that? Well, here's kind of the quick tips on that. In a process improvement effort, you absolutely want somebody who's managing that process, who's going to be ultimately accountable for that process, right? Typically, they're the manager of a department or a director of the department. They need to be part of it. The other person you need is somebody that is a subject matter expert in that process. So somebody that's been there, done that, knows the details, knows all the ins and outs. Typically, that's going to be an employee who actually does the work, right? But they have subject matter expertise. The other person you might want, and it could be the same as the subject matter expert, is somebody who's an exemplar, somebody who follows that process to the letter, right? And who demonstrates time after time 100% efficiency, proficiency in that process. They do it super well because they're also going to be the ones that can tell you, pinpoint where the issues are, right? So that's what I would refer to as an exemplar. Doesn't necessarily have to be the same person that's the subject matter expert. Sometimes they are. And then last but not least, I would include somebody that does training on the process. So it's typically a trainer, somebody that's going to be coaching or giving feedback to employees on the process, because you want them to know what the new process is going to be so that they can tailor their training. All right, so those are the players. Anybody outside of those people are probably going to give you a lot of information that's not going to be helpful. It's not going to move the needle, right? It's going to slow things down. It's going to become a bottleneck. All right, that's sin number 2. Excuse me. Sin number 3, process improvement teams are not given a clear, appropriate charter and are not held accountable for fulfilling that charter. So how many of you in the chat room, how many of you are familiar with the whole notion of a project charter? So it's usually a document. Okay, I see some head nods, no. All right. I only see like 4 faces, so by the way, or 2 faces at a time. So like a fidelity checklist, kind of like a fidelity checklist, sure, except with one caveat. Charter is typically what gets documented as who's in the team, what are the roles or responsibilities, and what are the specific targeted goals, what's the objectives of that team, right? So for those who are familiar with the world of schools and education, I'm going to pick on that because it's kind of an easy one to wrap your head around. If you're hopefully more than most of you are familiar with IEPs, individualized education plans. Anybody here familiar with IEPs? Yes. Okay. A couple. Okay. So an IEP, right? And if you're a parent, if you ever get this experience, you'll see it. It's a whole team, and they document the IEP. And in the IEP, it talks about who the team members are, what the goals are for the child, what the objectives are, what's the timeline, etc. Essentially, an IEP is a team charter. It just includes the parent and the counselor and the teachers and so on, right? So in the world of business, project charters, team charters are not necessarily new, but what we do identify time and time again is when process improvement teams are put together, more often than not, they're lacking a team charter. They don't have very clear direction on who's doing what are the goals, what are the objectives, and what's the timeline. So that's the tip on how to get rid of this sin. To remove this sin, make sure you have a good project team charter. And you could actually Google team charters and you'll get all sorts of templates. There's hundreds that exist out there. All right, let's go to sin number 4. The top management team thinks that if it's not nuking the existing organization, meaning re-engineering, it's not making significant improvements. Okay, in the world of process improvement, we know that sometimes the smallest improvement can actually make a huge difference, right? So whether it's a new job aid or maybe eliminating redundancies, right? Eliminating some steps, or maybe just sometimes the form or the format of a form that somebody has to fill out as part of a process just needs some tweaking. We know that in the world of process improvement, sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest difference. However, every now and again, you meet an executive or a senior manager who simply just wants to start from scratch. They want to restructure everything. They want to re-engineer the organization. They want to move the boxes on the org chart because they think that that is going to be a significant change. So how do we go from a top manager thinking that way, right, versus our approach being scientific, right? Behavioral science is all about being scientific and making sure we do the right change to make the biggest impact. And the best way I know how to do that, the tip of the day for removing the sin, is educate, educate, educate. So we need data to prove what we're talking about. Because it's very difficult, if the upper management has that in mind, it's very difficult to go against that if you don't have enough data to support it. So the process improvement that you're trying to make, even if it's small, you have to have enough data to show, here's how significant of an improvement this will make. And here's how we know that. Sometimes it's easier said than done. If you don't have the data, test it out. Do like a trial and error. Test out the new way and get some data, right? That's the best way I would know how to do that. So with data, that's the best way to get rid of sin number 4. All right, a couple more. Sin number 5. Process designers don't sufficiently consider how the changes will affect the people who have to work in the new process. So this is a byproduct of not having the right people in the room. If you are a part of a process team and you have all the greatest intentions in the world, but you're not the ones that are actually going to be doing the new job, the new process, we already have a problem, because more than likely you're designing it, even with the best intentions, you're not considering all the different intricacies from the viewpoint of the person who has to do the work. So sin number 5, the best way to make sure that doesn't happen, first, go back to the previous sin of making sure you have the right people in the room, which is sin number 2. And then I had to look that up myself. And then the second tip I would offer here is, let's say you don't have all the employees in the team. Let's say you don't have enough representatives. The best way to do to make sure that this sin doesn't happen to you is to pilot test your new process with the employees, right? So you've already designed it. You've already written out the process. You already got subject matter expertise input, right? But before you go live, before you launch that new initiative, that new process, test it out, trial it out with the employees, get their feedback first. There's an old saying that I like. I didn't make it up. I just don't know who the author is of this saying, but I love it. It's called authorship equals ownership. So the more that I author a change, meaning I put my stamp of approval or my signature or my words in it, the more that I author the change, the more that I own that change. So that's my tip for sin number 5. When process designers don't sufficiently consider how the changes will affect the people who have to do the work in the new process, get them involved, get their feedback early on, test the process before you implement it fully. All right, you guys are awesome. Sin number 6, the organization focuses more on redesign than on implementation. So I'll give you a little picture of this, what this looks like in my own experience. I was working with a process improvement team in the telecommunications department. We spent months sitting in an office space with whiteboards and post-it notes on the wall and flip charts, and we were going to town on redesigning this process. What we didn't do, this was a failure on my part as well, what we didn't do was actually consider and focus on how we were going to implement this new process that looked very pretty on a wall. We took so much time in the design, we failed to recognize that half of what we designed was not going to be able to be implemented by the company given the current systems, given the current IT software that they had. We designed this process to include a software that didn't exist in the company. So that made no sense, and we realized that, and we put our hands on our foreheads, and we had to get back to the drawing board. So the best way to get rid of this sin, so the sin is the organization focuses more on redesign than on implementation. To make sure you avoid that sin is during the design phase is to start asking the questions of, how are we actually going to implement this? What does that look like? Who's doing what? What systems are we going to use? What protocols, et cetera? How are we going to actually do this? And you already have all the right people in the room, presumably, right? You have the subject matter expert, the exemplar, you have the trainers, et cetera. So you have the right people in the room. They just have to put their heads together and say, how will we get this done? How will we actually implement this? All right, and sin number 7 is teams fail to leave behind a measurement system and other parts of the infrastructure necessary for continuous process improvement. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that a process improvement team is simply implementing a new process. They make it act like a project. So there's a starting point and there's an end point. What this entails is what happens when the new process is implemented. How are we going to know that it's actually going to be working and sustaining for the long run? And the best advice I can give you to avoid this sin is to make sure that the steward, the sponsor of the process improvement team, the executive or upper management, is looking at it and discussing things in terms of ongoing management. How are we going to know this new process actually is sustaining for the long run? So to give you a couple of quick tips, a quick tip in the world of business is an auditing protocol. So you design an auditing protocol for the process, for the new process that gets implemented by the right department, whoever the right department is, that's going to own that process. So somebody mentioned a hiring process, right? So typically the hiring process is managed by human resources, right? So if we go to implement a new hiring process, then the human resource department can have an auditing protocol to audit every once a quarter or once a month how the process is going. And this, Selena, is where your fidelity checklist comes in. So you want to make sure that there's some type of measurement system that says things are going in the right way, the way that we designed it, and it's not derailing. So hopefully that makes sense, folks. Hopefully that makes sense. And I'm happy to answer any and all questions you have. So those are the 7 deadly sins of process improvement by Gary Rumler and Alan Brash. For those staying in the chat room, when I end the recording, I'll put those 7 in the chat room just so you have them all. Make sure that I saw a lot of people rigorously writing, so I just want to make sure you got it all. But I highly recommend this book because it goes way deeper into the world of process improvement. They also do tutorials on process mapping, right, which is an exercise for process improvement. So it's a great book, great read. As you can see, I'm an avid reader of this book. I go to it a lot. So without further ado, folks, that's it for Mondays with Manny. We topped it up at about 20 minutes, so that's pretty good. So thank you all for joining me, and for those in the live audience, please stick around for some Q&A, and otherwise, have a great rest of your Monday, and I'll see you next time.